What's going on, U.S. History people? This is Mr. Norris.
And Mr. Lawrence.
We have the final part. This is it, Mr. Lawrence. The
Wow.
third one. And chances are, what you see in your exam, we will have covered on the video.
Fingers crossed.
All right, let's start with the Roaring Twenties. We have politics, two presidents you should be familiar with. Warren G. Harding, and here he is. He campaigned on something, a return to normalcy, kind of going back to neutrality, staying out of foreign affairs, and a smaller government. So this is kind of the anti-progressive era. And he was associated with some scandal, most notably the Teapot Dome scandal, in which one of his cabinet members illegally transferred government property to a private business, and they profited from it.
So after President Harding, we have Calvin Coolidge elected, and he promotes something called Coolidge prosperity. And this is referred to kind of as a laissez-faire economic policy. Again, as Mr. Norris just said, during the early 20s, we were kind of going backwards away from progressive ideas and trying to get to that return to normalcy of a laissez-faire style economy, less government involvement, smaller government. It's kind of a reaction to the progressives during the time period.
Nativism is something that is very important to understand, not only throughout U.S. history, but especially in the 1920s. We have the Emergency Quota Act and the National Origins Act of 1924. Both of these severely restricted immigration. So if we take a look at this very popular political cartoon, we'll see all these immigrants from Europe are coming through this funnel, and really only 3% of them can come in. Uncle Sam is severely restricting immigration. They set up quotas or a set number of immigrants that could come to the country.
So tied into nativism of the 20s, we have the Sacco and Vanzetti trial. These were two immigrants who were convicted of murder and eventually sentenced to death. Now they considered themselves to be anarchists. They were not necessarily aligned with the traditional political culture of the United States. So it wasn't as much about the actual murder itself, which was a horrible thing, but it was more seen as nativist, or kind of a nativist case, where some people accused Sacco and Vanzetti of, or really the government, of not giving them a fair trial because they were immigrants at the time.
Yeah, their beliefs were more on trial as opposed to the murder. So women in the 1920s, we know this, we think of flappers, but an important thing happens in 1920 with the creation of the 19th Amendment. That's women's suffrage or the right to vote. Remember, you will not see the word right to vote, the words right to vote on the Regents exam. You will see suffrage, so be familiar with that.
All right, also very important during the 1920s is the Harlem Renaissance, so a celebration of African-American culture and music. Know the poets Claude McKay, guys by the name of Langston Hughes as well. Very important, kind of a rebirth of African-American culture, specifically focused in the neighborhood of New York City in Harlem.
All right, jumping over to the Great Depression, the end of the 1920s, President Hoover is president, and he responds to the Depression with little government action, and he relied on volunteerism, and he urged businesses to keep wages and production at status quo.
All right, so Hoover is not reelected because many Americans felt he was not doing enough to try and end the Depression. A guy by the name of Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president, and he comes in with the idea of a New Deal, and what he proposes is something called the Alphabet Soup program, part of the New Deal. And we see different programs. The first one is the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps, that put young men to work between the ages of 18 to 24. And what they were doing were environmental projects, planting trees, building parks, also really focusing on, remember that term we talked about, Mr. Norris?
Conservation.
Conservation and
infrastructure.
Yes, we're going to see that throughout these programs. Things like roads, bridges, schools, and possibly even dams.
The TVA, speaking of dams, the Tennessee Valley Authority, was the building of dams that help provide jobs in hydroelectric power, and there will be a lot of electricity available to people living in the Tennessee area.
The AAA was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which actually paid farmers not to grow crops. Please underline that, circle that. They were actually paid not to grow crops. The Supreme Court did declare this unconstitutional in a case Butler v. U.S. Kind of the idea that why were farmers getting paid not to work when other people were not getting paid not to work. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. So the National Industrial Recovery Act, or the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, that allowed the president to set codes for industries, things like how much businesses should charge, how much they should pay, working hours. And this was declared unconstitutional in the court case Schechter Poultry versus the United States. So what we see is two alphabet soup programs are declared illegal are declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court.
So this makes FDR very concerned, and he knows he has the power to appoint justices. So what he really petitions the Congress for is what's called his court packing plan, where he would actually expand the size of the Supreme Court. So for every judge over 70 that does not retire, he could appoint a new one. It would allow him to appoint up to 6 new judges at the time. Ultimately, was this successful, Mr. Norris?
No, it was not. Even members of his own party thought he was trying to get too much power.
Some historians and political scientists do see that he was willing to kind of do something to try and get some of these cases through. So it really made the Supreme Court kind of re-examine and really start to allow some of those New Deal programs to really go through and be considered constitutional as a result of this controversy.
All right, let's jump on over to World War II. So we have some neutrality acts from 1935 to 1937. And this say that the U.S. could not trade with warring or belligerent countries. And it did not matter who was the aggressor or who was the victim. So we see the United States trying to stay out of European issues. And also, U.S. citizens could not travel on ships from warring nations. That's kind of going back to World War I, when U.S. citizens were on the Lusitania that was sunk due to German unrestricted submarine warfare.
Now, some Americans were really concerned with the rise of fascism, Nazis in Europe, the way that Japan was kind of spreading its power throughout Asia. So what the government does decide to do is a program called the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, where the U.S. could lend crucial supplies to countries the president deems vital, specifically like countries like Great Britain and the allied nations throughout Europe.
Now, jumping ahead to the end of World War II, if you see a question about why did Harry Truman use the atomic bomb, and here are the crew of the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the atomic bomb. Here is Captain Tibbets, the pilot of it. The answer is going to be to save American. So jumping ahead to the end of the war, if we see a question about why did Harry Truman use the atomic bomb, the answer is going to be to save American lives. And here we see the crew of the Enola Gay, and in the center is Paul Tibbets, the pilot of this. So any question about why was the atomic bomb dropped, there were many reasons, but chances are will be because of saving American lives.
Now, the role of women is consistently changing throughout American history. We see this happening also in World War II. We've talked about the creation of Rosie the Riveter, kind of this fictional character to show the idea of women in the workforce. We see it in films, magazines, etc. It really focused on women, really millions of women who took part in factory jobs, and we also saw an increase for families through women working.
Continuing with the home front, we have Japanese Americans in the very famous court case Korematsu v. the U.S. That is a result of an executive order by Harry Truman that created these Japanese internment camps for Japanese Americans, 2/3 of which were citizens born in the United States. And 100,000 plus Japanese Americans on the West Coast were moved to camps, and this was upheld in Korematsu v. the United States. This is an example of, during times of war or crisis, your rights go down. All right, continuing with the home front, Mexican Americans, we have an increase in workers from Mexico through something called the Bracero program. So we have a lot of immigrants coming over to America, and this leads to tension seen in Los Angeles, California with the Zoot Suit riots. And these were conflicts between sailors and Marines and Mexican Americans. It's basically like a 2 or 3 day riot in which many young Mexican Americans were attacked by the U.S. military.
So again, we're seeing African Americans very involved with the war effort, whether working at home or fighting on the actual battlefront. There was something called the Double V campaign, victory abroad over fascism and victory at home over racism. So again, World War II will be another step towards equality and civil rights in the United States. We will see.
The Cold War begins immediately after the end of World War II. We got to know this dude, George Kennan. He was known for something called containment. Dude lived to be 101 years old as well. So he's the father of containment. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're writing any essay, foreign policy, post-World War II, there's no way you can write a solid essay without including containment and this desire to keep communism from spreading. So what's the impact of this? Well, it helped end the U.S. policy of isolation. This is the final dagger in George Washington's ghost that keeps him from coming back.
So we have President Truman in office at the end of World War II because FDR has passed away. He's responsible for dropping the atomic bomb and really bringing World War II to an end. But he's also the first president during the Cold War. And what he proposes with the idea of containment is the Truman Doctrine, which is $400 million for military and economic aid to the countries of Greece and Turkey to fight against the spread of communism. So again, Truman Doctrine, think of what two countries?
Greece and Turkey. So the Marshall Plan is a policy continuing along the lines of containment, and this is that the U.S. would spend billions of dollars in Europe to help improve the war-torn area and to help improve the economy. If the economy is prosperous, the U.S. thinks communism will not be as appealing.
All right, so we have the second Red Scare. The first Red Scare we talked about during the early 1920s, and now we have the second one at the end of World War II in 1945. And we have the House on Un-American Activities Committee, accused of sharing 65 classified documents to really the public. And there was a group known as the Hollywood 10. There were 10 screenwriters that refused to testify before the House and sentenced to jail. Really, all these people were accused of being American communists.
And then we have McCarthyism. Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin. He accused the State Department officials of being communists. By the way, this is Alger Hiss, who is the guy that was accused by HUAC. This is not Joseph McCarthy. And the downfall of Joseph McCarthy happened when he attacked the army on TV.
So finally we have the Rosenbergs, who were a couple, husband and wife, convicted of giving atomic bomb secrets to the Soviets. So once the Soviets gain access to the atomic bomb, it will really ignite this arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union. Both of them were convicted and eventually sentenced to death for spying.
All right, continuing with this, with the Eisenhower's administration, we have Sputnik is launched by the Soviet Union. This is the first satellite in outer space, and this led to the space race, and the U.S. began to increase its spending on science and education in the United States.
We also had the U-2 spy plane controversy, where U.S. plane was shot down spying over the Soviet Union. The pilot was actually captured, put on trial in the Soviet Union publicly, and this also increased tensions between the U.S. and the Soviets.
Jumping on down to our neighbor to the south, Cuba, located 90 miles off the coast of Florida. In April 1961, there was an invasion that takes place known as the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it's known as that because it is located right here. Now, the reason the U.S. is invading Cuba is because Fidel Castro comes to power and he is a communist. So the U.S. wants to keep communism from spreading. The U.S. provided aid to rebels to try to overthrow the Castro government, and it is a huge failure. And this will actually bring the USSR, the Soviet Union, and Cuba closer together.
So what President Kennedy proposes, a quarantine of Cuba. So when something is quarantined, nothing is allowed in or out. So eventually the Soviets, as a result of this quarantine and the American Navy surrounding Cuba, the Soviet Union will withdraw all missiles. The U.S. will also promise not to attack Cuba and remove the Castro regime. And finally, the U.S. would withdraw missiles from Turkey. That part was not as well known to the American people as much as the first part, the Soviets really removing the missiles and ending the crisis.
And here is a picture of JFK and his advisors during the Cuban Missile Crisis talking about what they can do to avoid nuclear war. This is the closest the two sides ever came to war, and this is an example of brinkmanship. All right, so civil rights in the 1950s and 1960s, we're jumping to now. We have Brown versus the Board of Education, which reversed Plessy versus Ferguson. And Mr. Lawrence, what did Plessy versus Ferguson state again?
Well, what this stated was that separate but equal facilities, specifically, well, it was really across the United States, but we saw this more in the South, was legal. If it was separate, it had to be equal. So it really legalized segregation and really supported Jim Crow in the late 1800s.
I'd be floored if you don't see Brown versus Board and or Plessy on your exam. Then it also said states must desegregate schools with all deliberate speed. And as Mr. Lawrence will tell us, that does not happen. And an example of this is
Little Rock 9. So in Little Rock, Arkansas, the South is really going through something they called massive resistance. Yes, the Brown case was decided, but they chose as states that they are not really going to support it. They're just not going to segregate. So 9 students in Little Rock, Arkansas decided that they wanted to go to Central High School, and they chose to go to the school, which was yet to be desegregated. So what happened here is Eisenhower, president at the time, sent in federal troops to allow students to attend the Little Rock High School.
And also in the 1950s, we had the Montgomery bus boycott started by this woman, Rosa Parks. And in the background, we see a young 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr., and he drew on ideas from Jesus, Henry David Thoreau, and Gandhi, and he was using nonviolent civil disobedience. And 1 year later, the Montgomery buses were desegregated. So we see in the 1950s a push for desegregation, but it is not everywhere.
All right, so moving to the 1960s, we have in Greensboro, North Carolina, sit-ins begin throughout parts of the state and throughout parts of the South, where people would go into segregated areas, sit where the law said they were not allowed to, and they would ask to be served, and they would sit there until they were served or until they were arrested.
And that inspired a bunch of other inns, like kneel-ins at churches, bowl-ins at bowling alleys, wade-ins at beaches, and pools. Martin Luther King Jr. focused on Birmingham, the most contentious city in the South, and he and others were arrested for protesting, where he wrote his very famous letter from a Birmingham jail. And in here, he explained his reason for nonviolent civil disobedience. And again, he drew inspiration from Henry David Thoreau and Gandhi.
So in 1964, Congress and the president finally decide to promote civil rights from the federal level and guaranteed equal access to all public accommodations, officially outlawing segregation in the United States.
And the Voting Rights Act of 1965 saw the elimination of literacy tests, and the number of African Americans registered to vote in the South skyrocketed. There was a large increase of the number in the South.
All right, let's move to the 1950s, specifically the Interstate Highway Act. Very important. Highlight it, star it, circle it, need to know it. And this was the largest public works project to date in the 1950s. It created 42,000 miles of highway and could be used for evacuation in case of nuclear war, helped to spur growth. So this really promotes the growth of American society farther west, also the growth of the automobile in suburbs.
So we have Levittown, which were these cookie-cutter houses in Long Island, a development, and they were duplicated in many other cities across the country. So these houses were built every 16 minutes or so. They kind of took the ideas of Ford's factory system of this mass production and applying them to houses. This led to white flight, or many white families moving to the suburbs, and many blacks, especially from the South, because there was a great migration, a second one during World War II, moved to cities in the North.
In the 1950s, we see a rise of consumerism, which meaning more people are buying stuff. Consumer credit increased drastically during the 1950s. We see the development of credit cards and store credit cards, which we still have today. Car manufacturers produced more and newer products, more stylish cars. Also, we see the development of new appliances, including dishwashers, garbage disposals, and televisions.
So JFK's new frontier, he's elected in 1960, and this is focusing on many areas, including, it's focusing on many areas in people to achieve their best, and especially as it comes to space. The new frontier was this idea that the U.S. could go to outer space, and he promised a man on the moon by the end of the decade.
All right, LBJ's Great Society was a focus on civil rights and the elimination of poverty in the United States. Also, one issue that LBJ faces is the increased involvement in Vietnam, and the Great Society competed for both cash and on the federal level.
Two important books that you have to know. The first one is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, and she wrote about the harmful effects of pesticides on the environment. And The Feminine Mystique was written by this woman, Betty Friedan, and she brought attention to challenges that many housewives face, that many of them, although they enjoyed being housewives and raising families, felt that there was more they could do and more contributions they could have to society. And this really helped start the women's rights movement of the 1960s.
All right, 1969, a very important year because we see the American moon landing, and also Woodstock happens, a huge concert in upstate New York. It's kind of the growth of what was referred to the hippie or the counterculture movement of the 1960s and leads into the 1970s.
So the Vietnam War in 1954, we have the fall of Dien Bien Phu, in which the French leave Vietnam, and because of the domino theory and containment, the U.S. increases its presence. And we see in 1964 the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gives President Johnson the ability to do anything necessary to prevent future attacks. So Congress gives one of their powers, the ability to declare war, to the president. And what happens is Johnson escalates the war in Vietnam, and U.S. involvement increases drastically.
All right, Vietnamization was something that we talked about earlier in the course this year, and what this was President Nixon's plan to gradually withdraw U.S. troops from Vietnam and replace with trained South Vietnamese troops. You're really having South Vietnamese troops take the fight to the north and replace the American troops.
And the War Powers Act of 1973 limited the president's involvement in wars. This is essentially overturning the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, and it states that the president must inform Congress before war actions are taken.
All right, a phrase that we need to know for the course is something called the Warren Court, and this was led by Chief Justice Earl Warren from 1953 to 1969. So these decisions affected the rights of criminals and the accused, religion, civil rights, and women. So we talked about a lot of these cases already in class, but just a real quick reminder. Mapp v. Ohio provides for search warrants. Gideon v. Wainwright is a right to a lawyer, even if you can't afford one. Escobedo v. Illinois is the right to a lawyer from the time of arrest. Miranda v. Arizona, the right to remain silent. And Engel v. Vitale, school-sanctioned prayer is unconstitutional.
Griswold versus Connecticut say that birth control is legal, and Tinker versus Des Moines said this free speech is fine in school as long as it is not disruptive, especially symbolic free speech by wearing a black armband. Chief Justice Warren Burger was the next justice after Earl Warren, and Roe versus Wade stated that abortion was legal. Nixon visits China, and the U.S. relations with China improve. And this is important because China is a communist country, and the Soviet Union was concerned over the U.S.-Chinese relationship. And this helps lead to a policy under Nixon that you have to know, known as détente.
So détente was the easing of Cold War tensions, leads us to SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty of 1972, an agreement to limit nuclear weapons. So if you go to the nuclear weapons doctor, you need to reduce your
SALT.
SALT.
The Watergate complex, here is a picture of it right here. This was the scandal that ultimately led to the resignation of Nixon on June 17th, 1972. There was a break-in at the Democratic headquarters, and Nixon resigns due to his part in the cover-up. So it's not always the crime, it is the cover-up that will get you in trouble.
Was President Nixon impeached?
He was not impeached. He would have been, but he resigned before being impeached.
All right, so when he leaves office, his Vice President Ford comes into office, and one thing he does right away is he pardons President Nixon. Many Americans were upset about this, and some believe that there was some kind of deal between both of them, that he would step down, giving the presidency to Ford, and that was not so good for President Ford.
Under Carter, who becomes president in 1976, we see the Iran hostage crisis in 1979, and the Camp David Accords. Everybody circle this right now for us, please. This is a peace agreement between Israel and Egypt. So this is an attempt to bring peace to the Middle East.
All right, so in 1981, we have President Reagan take office, and he promotes something called the Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars. It was Reagan's nuclear defense plan, where space stations could use lasers to defend against nuclear attacks. He also promoted supply-side economics, or what was called Reaganomics, where they would actually cut taxes for the wealthy. In theory, the rich would use this money to invest and spend and then improve the economy.
George H.W. Bush became president in 1989, and we have the first Persian Gulf War. On August 2nd, 1990, Saddam Hussein and Iraq invaded Kuwait, and the U.S. and NATO attacked Iraq, and Saddam Hussein withdrew from Kuwait.
All right, leading us to the 1990s. The first George Bush only served for one term. President Bill Clinton was elected, served from 1993 to 2001. Some economic issues. We had a growth of the internet causing businesses to boom, as well as the stock market. So we had strong economic times. The 1990s was an unprecedented era of prosperity for the United States.
The North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, was signed by Bill Clinton, and there's his Vice President Al Gore. And this was signed in 1993, and this eliminated tariffs between Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. Some people argue that it led to outsourcing or the elimination of jobs. Others argue that it led to cheaper prices.
This is an important era as well because the baby boom generation, really of the 1950s, begins to retire and leads to issues with Social Security. It's called the graying of America.
All right, some miscellaneous information that we did not cover in the videos. Booker T. Washington, we're going way back to post-Civil War. Know this dude, he favored economic opportunities and vocational training.
We had the Great Migrations, which we briefly touched on, was a mass movement of African Americans to the north from the south after World Wars.
And the Bonus Army, this was under Hoover's administration under Hoover's administration, and these were World War I vets that demanded an early bonus in 1932, and it was broken up by Hoover, who sent in the military. All right, guys, thank you. Congrats on finishing all 3 videos. You're going to do awesome on your test. We appreciate you watching and studying.
Good luck.
Good luck. We'll see you on the other side.